She warned me with a smile, "Don't lean on me, unless you want me to hold you." And just like that, my heart started betraying me. The first time I met her, I didn't know what to expect. My boss had casually mentioned that his sister would be dropping by the office for a small gathering, but I hadn't realized just how magnetic she would be. She wasn't loud or overbearing, but there was a quiet confidence about her that made the air feel warmer around her. She moved with a grace that immediately drew my eyes, a subtle elegance that didn't need attention yet commanded it. When she stepped into the room, her eyes caught mine for just a second, a spark of curiosity, perhaps amusement, and that alone sent an unexpected flutter through my chest. She was mid-40s, striking in an understated way, her hair falling softly around her face, the faintest shimmer of jewelry catching the light. She smiled at me with that teasing half-smile, the kind that hinted she already knew exactly the effect she had. The first accidental touch came quickly, almost absurdly small. We were reaching for the same cup of coffee on a side table, and our hands brushed. My heart jumped. Her skin was warm against mine, not shocking, but intimate enough to make me notice the brush lingered a fraction too long. She didn't pull back. Instead, she looked at me with a spark of amusement, and said lightly, "Don't lean on me unless you want me to hold you." I froze for a moment, caught between embarrassment and intrigue. There was nothing overtly sexual about it, yet the teasing edge in her voice made my pulse race. I couldn't decide if I was supposed to laugh, blush, or run, so I just smiled awkwardly. She leaned slightly, a subtle gesture that felt like an invitation, safe, playful, but undeniably charged. I realized then that this would be no ordinary encounter. The room buzzed around us with idle chatter, but I found myself focused entirely on her, the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, the warmth in her presence that seemed to wrap around me. It was disorienting and exciting at the same time. For a brief moment, I could feel her energy as clearly as if her hand was still on mine, a gentle pull, a quiet gravity drawing me closer. I tried to focus on small talk, asking questions about her work, her travels, anything that might anchor me in civility, but the conversation always swerved toward that subtle teasing. Each glance felt loaded with intent, though I wasn't sure what kind yet. She leaned just a little too close, laughed a little too softly, and every time our hands or arms touched, even by accident, I felt a startling spark of awareness. By the time I left that evening, my mind was spinning. I couldn't stop replaying her words, the warmth of her shoulder beneath mine, the quiet confidence in her smile. She had entered my life with a single teasing remark, and somehow, I already felt tethered to her, curious, cautious, and inexplicably drawn in. That accidental touch, that playful warning, had set the stage for something I couldn't yet name, but I knew it would linger long after the office lights dimmed. The days following our first meeting felt strangely charged. I kept finding myself replaying her words. "Don't lean on me unless you want me to hold you," and the way her teasing smile had held mine captive. It was impossible to act entirely normal around her, even in casual, everyday interactions. Yet she seemed completely at ease, confident, and fully aware of the effect she had on me. Our encounters grew more frequent, a brief meeting at the office, a shared elevator ride, a conversation in the kitchen. Each time, there was a subtle push and pull in her behavior, a playful test of boundaries that left my thoughts spinning long after we parted. She'd lean just slightly closer than necessary, a hand brushing against mine while handing over a folder, or a fleeting touch on my shoulder that lingered almost imperceptibly. Every gesture was loaded with intention, though never overt, and it kept me on edge in the best possible way. One afternoon, I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on her desk. As I bent down to help her pick them up, she let out a small laugh, her voice soft yet teasing, and touched my back lightly to steady me. "Careful," she said, her hand resting for just a heartbeat longer than needed. My chest tightened. The warmth of her hand, the quiet steadiness of her touch, made it almost impossible to think about anything else. I could feel the tension coil in my shoulders, the subtle awareness of how close we were, and yet she didn't move away. I caught myself lingering in those small moments, noticing everything about her, the curve of her lips when she smiled, the slight crinkle of her eyes, the calm patience in her movements. She carried herself in a way that was elegant without demanding attention, but every glance and gesture seemed deliberately calibrated, and I could feel the magnetic pull between us growing. Her teasing, playful as it was, had a gentle undertone of familiarity. She'd comment on my distracted glances or my nervous hesitation, calling them out with a sly smile, but never harshly. It was as if she could see straight through my internal chaos and found amusement rather than judgment. I wanted to withdraw, to remind myself of boundaries, but something about her presence made me feel safe, even while my mind raced with curiosity and desire. Even our conversations were layered. On the surface, we spoke about work, plans, and shared observations. Beneath that, there was a subtle rhythm of closeness, the brief touch of hands, the leaning in slightly when she laughed, the unspoken challenge in her eyes. Each encounter was a careful dance, a test of limits that neither of us fully acknowledged but both clearly felt. By the end of the week, I realized how much I had begun to anticipate these small interactions, how each brush of her hand or playful remark lingered in my thoughts, leaving a warmth that was equal parts comforting and thrilling. She had a way of drawing me in without forcing anything, testing my awareness, and in doing so, deepening the tension that neither of us seemed ready to resolve. The line between professional distance and personal closeness was blurring, and I wasn't sure which side I wanted to remain on. One thing was certain. I was becoming acutely aware of her, in ways that made every accidental touch, every lingering look, feel like a promise yet unspoken. It was a quiet evening when the distance between us began to feel smaller, almost imperceptibly so. She had invited me to help with a minor task at her home, nothing official, just sorting through some paperwork she needed assistance with. I had expected it to be simple, mundane, but the atmosphere she cultivated transformed it into something entirely different, intimate, easy, and charged in a way I couldn't quite name. As I stepped into her living room, the warmth of her space enveloped me. Soft lighting cast a gentle glow over the bookshelves, the framed photographs on the walls, and the vase of fresh flowers she had placed on the table. Everything about the room reflected her calm confidence and refined taste, and I felt an unexpected sense of comfort, as if stepping inside her home had invited me into a private world. We worked side by side, quietly organizing papers and discussing minor details of the task. It was during those simple moments that the tension began to shift from playful teasing to something softer, more profound. Our hands brushed occasionally, once when passing a stack of envelopes, once when reaching for the same pen. Each touch was fleeting, yet electric in its subtlety. Her hand felt warm and reassuring, as though she was silently telling me that it was okay to be close. At one point, she leaned back slightly in her chair, and I caught her off-guard gaze. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the soft texture of her sweater against her arm, and the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Everything about her presence demanded attention without demanding it outright. We began to talk, really talk, about life, choices, regrets, and dreams. She shared stories from her past with a surprising vulnerability, and I found myself listening intently, hanging on every word. In response, I opened up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing small, personal details that felt weightless in her presence. There was no judgment, no rush, just a slow, growing understanding between us. At one point, our legs brushed beneath the table. I felt the warmth of her proximity and the steady cadence of her heartbeat, and for the first time, I allowed myself to notice how natural it felt to be near her. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. Our shoulders brushed as we reached for a misplaced envelope, and that tiny, shared space between us seemed charged with possibility. By the time I left that evening, I realized how profoundly different she made me feel. Her presence was calming, yet exciting, comforting, yet undeniably stirring. I was aware of every small gesture, every fleeting touch, and every glance that lingered just a moment too long. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she had begun to occupy a space in my thoughts that I hadn't intended to give her. The seed of connection had been planted. It was subtle, quiet, and powerful all at once. In the comfort of shared moments, I felt the first stirrings of something deeper, an unspoken understanding and a mutual curiosity that neither of us had yet dared to name, but both of us were beginning to feel. After the quiet closeness we had shared, the tension between us became impossible to ignore. Every interaction carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. She remained playful, teasing, and utterly confident, but beneath her teasing, there was a subtle depth, an unspoken awareness of the effect she had on me, and of course, the age gap, the social lines, and my own hesitation made me acutely aware of boundaries I wasn't sure I could navigate. It started with the little things. During a casual gathering, she brushed past me to reach for a drink, and our shoulders accidentally touched. I felt the warmth of her skin against mine, and for a heartbeat, my mind went blank. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked back at me with that soft, knowing smile. That single glance said so much: recognition, curiosity, amusement. My chest tightened, and I realized just how much my body had begun to respond to her presence without my conscious consent. Our conversations also began to take on a new tone. She'd make a sly remark about something personal, my work habits, my tendency to overthink, and I'd catch the subtle undercurrent of her voice, the softness behind the teasing. It was flattering, but it also stirred a sense of vulnerability I wasn't used to exposing. I wanted to pull back, to maintain the safe distance of professionalism, yet I found myself leaning forward, hanging on her every word, drawn to her presence like a magnet. One afternoon, while we were working together on a minor project, we found ourselves standing close, reviewing documents side by side. I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle sway of her posture, and even the faint scent of her perfume filled the small space between us. My hand brushed hers accidentally as we reached for the same pen. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears, while she simply smiled lightly, holding my gaze for a fleeting moment that felt much longer. That single shared heartbeat of awareness was intoxicating. And yet doubt lingered. I questioned myself constantly: is this appropriate? Do I misread her intentions? Am I crossing lines I shouldn't? The internal struggle was exhausting but exhilarating. She, too, seemed aware of the tension. Sometimes her teasing sharpened just enough to remind me that she noticed my hesitation, yet softened enough to encourage me to stay close. By the end of the day, I realized the emotional tug-of-war was undeniable. I was caught between desire and propriety, curiosity and restraint, fascination and caution. Every glance, every brush of her hand, every subtle laugh seemed to pull me deeper into a delicate web I wasn't ready to untangle. And yet, despite the conflict, I found myself wanting to be caught, to lean into the closeness, to allow the unspoken feelings to surface, even if only in fleeting moments. It was a dangerous, thrilling balance, the magnetic pull of her presence, the delicate dance of proximity, and the silent acknowledgement that we were both aware of the tension, yet neither of us rushed to define it. The line between playful interaction and emotional intimacy blurred, leaving me suspended in a quiet, heated anticipation, unsure of where it would lead, but certain I didn't want to pull away. The next step in our subtle dance came unexpectedly, during one of those quiet evenings that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of life. She had invited me over under the guise of helping with a minor household chore, but the air between us felt different, heavier with unspoken words. It wasn't playful teasing this time. There was a softness in her tone, a calmness in her movements, as if she were deliberately drawing me closer, emotionally and physically, without breaking the fragile boundaries we had been testing for weeks. We settled in the living room, a stack of papers and folders forgotten at our sides, and she began to speak quietly, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. She talked about her life, the loneliness she sometimes felt despite being surrounded by people, the challenges she faced juggling responsibilities, the small disappointments that accumulated over time. I listened, captivated not only by her words but by the vulnerability she rarely showed anyone. Her eyes met mine occasionally, steady and unflinching, daring me to respond with honesty of my own. I felt a strange combination of admiration and protectiveness. Here was someone so confident, so poised, revealing a tender side that few had the privilege of seeing. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand lightly over hers. The warmth of her skin was immediate and grounding, her fingers pressing back ever so slightly, as if to confirm that this touch was welcome. The simple connection sent a jolt through me, a mixture of reassurance, curiosity, and the faint stirrings of desire. Our conversation continued, ebbing and flowing with a natural intimacy. She shared moments of doubt, small regrets, and quiet dreams, and I responded with sincerity, offering my observations and reflections without judgment. Each time our hands brushed, each time our shoulders leaned together slightly, it was a silent affirmation that this closeness was mutual, carefully nurtured and tenderly held. The teasing that had defined our early encounters softened into something warmer, a gentle, knowing affection that carried with it the promise of understanding. At one point she paused, resting her hand fully atop mine, and simply smiled. That smile held recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of us named aloud. My heartbeat quickened, not from surprise but from the quiet thrill of emotional connection. I realized then that this was the first time I had felt entirely seen by her, not as a younger man fumbling with boundaries, but as a person worthy of attention, empathy, and care. By the time I left that evening, I carried with me more than just the memory of her warmth. I carried the echo of her voice, the reassurance of her touch, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that something had shifted between us. The teasing flirtation had evolved into emotional intimacy, and with it came the first hints of mutual desire, restrained, respectful, and quietly thrilling. For the first time, I didn't leave her presence feeling anxious or unsure. I left feeling connected, understood, and curiously exhilarated by the knowledge that the slow burn of our relationship had finally begun to deepen in ways either of us could ignore. The tension that had been building between us finally reached a point where it could no longer remain subtle. It happened on one of those quiet evenings that seemed almost suspended in time, the kind where ordinary tasks became intimate rituals, and the ordinary became extraordinary simply because of her presence. We were walking together after a small dinner she had invited me to, the streets glistening faintly from a light rain. The world felt softened, colors muted under the wet pavement, reflections shimmering like scattered memories. I noticed the subtle warmth radiating from her, the gentle sway of her hair, the rhythm of her steps beside mine. I found myself unconsciously closing the small gap between us, and she did not resist. When my shoulder brushed hers, it was no longer accidental. I felt the deliberate steadiness in her posture, as if she were subtly inviting my closeness. Then, with a quiet, teasing smile, she let herself lean gently against me. My heart thumped in my chest, a mixture of exhilaration and cautious thrill. Her body felt warm and solid against mine, yet her touch was tender, gentle, and profoundly grounding. For a brief moment, the space between us vanished, replaced by the quiet intimacy of shared presence. We didn't speak immediately. Words seemed unnecessary when every subtle movement, every glance, carried meaning. I could feel her steady breath, the warmth of her hand brushing lightly against my arm, the softness of her cheek as it nearly touched my shoulder. The playful teasing that had defined our early interactions had evolved into something deeper, a mutual acknowledgement of attraction, tempered by respect, curiosity, and restraint. Her eyes met mine, and in that glance, there was a quiet invitation. It wasn't a demand, nor was it overt. It was a shared understanding that this closeness was welcome, a silent confession of the mutual desire that had been simmering for weeks. I felt the tension in my own body ease slightly, replaced by a warm thrill as I allowed myself to respond naturally, letting my hand rest lightly against her back in reassurance, careful and measured, yet undeniably present. We continued walking in that small, comfortable proximity, words occasionally exchanged in soft, playful tones, but mostly silence, a silence that spoke louder than any conversation could. Each accidental brush of hands, each subtle shift in posture, reinforced the quiet acknowledgement that our connection had deepened, that we were navigating this delicate dance together. By the time we reached the door to part ways, the air between us was charged, intimate yet respectful. She leaned just slightly against me as we said our goodbyes, lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I could feel her warmth, her presence, and the unspoken promise of more to come. My mind raced with the realization that our playful teasing had transformed into genuine, heartfelt tension, a slow burn attraction that neither of us wanted to rush, yet both of us felt inescapably. Walking away that night, I carried the echo of her warmth, her steady presence, and the subtle, electrifying closeness of our shared moment. The slow burn romance had reached its peak, not in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet, resonant intimacy that left me both breathless and profoundly aware of the pull between us. The final chapter of our slow, winding connection unfolded quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried a profound sense of completion. It was one of those calm evenings when the world felt hushed, as if it had paused just to allow us this private moment. She had invited me over under the guise of casual company, but I could feel the anticipation in the subtle way she moved, the way her eyes lingered on mine just a heartbeat longer than usual. We found ourselves settled on her couch, soft lighting from a nearby lamp casting a gentle glow across the room. Everything about the space reflected her personality, warm, inviting, comfortable, yet imbued with quiet elegance. She reached for a blanket, draping it over both of our laps, and in that simple act, our shoulders brushed together. The warmth of her arm against mine felt familiar, comforting, the culmination of all the small touches, lingering glances, and quiet moments we had shared over the past weeks. She turned to me with that teasing half-smile, the same expression that had first caught me off guard, and whispered softly, "See? I told you, if you lean, I'll hold you." There was no challenge in her voice this time, only gentle affirmation. My chest tightened in response, a mixture of fondness, relief, and quiet joy. I allowed myself to lean slightly toward her, and she shifted effortlessly, letting me rest against her. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining naturally, as if this closeness had been meant to happen all along. In that moment, the slow-burn tension of our relationship finally resolved into gentle, satisfying intimacy. It wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was the quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had been building over time. Each touch, each glance, each subtle movement carried meaning, reinforcing the bond we had cultivated patiently. I felt her warmth, her steady presence, and the tender beat of her heart against mine, sensations that spoke louder than any words could. We talked softly, sharing stories and quiet laughter, each phrase a thread weaving us closer together. There was no rush, no urgency, only the comfort of being near someone who understood, who saw and accepted both the playful and vulnerable sides of me. Her teasing was now softened into affectionate nudges, her smiles lingering in ways that made my pulse quicken without a hint of awkwardness. As the evening drew on, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around her, careful yet protective. Our breathing slowly synced, and for a few timeless moments, it felt as though the outside world had melted away. The attraction, curiosity, and tension that had once defined our interactions had matured into something steady, gentle, and deeply satisfying. When I finally left, I carried with me the warmth of her touch, the echo of her laughter, and the knowledge that we had found something rare, a connection that honored both the age difference and the deep respect between us. The slow burn romance had reached its resolution, leaving a lingering sense of intimacy, trust, and quiet joy. In the soft aftermath, I realized that sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't explosive. They're patient, tender, and felt most deeply in the spaces between words, glances, and gentle touches.